Thanks very much. First of all, I want to apologize for not waiting for the microphone yesterday and misjudging the size of the room. I used my outside voice and it made me sound like I was criticizing what I'm a great user of and trying to help with, which is this set of tools that we've described these last few days. I want to talk to you about one of Ian and Carl and Steve's other babies, which I've been partly responsible for helping shepherd along, and many of you may have not been following for some time. And so the purpose of this talk is to get you up to date with the work that the Open Grid Forum has been doing in cloud and grid standards and associated implementation projects, test beds, a wealth of engagements with other organizations with new standards in cloud and grid computing and overall in advanced distributed computing. So what is Open Grid Forum? It is a leading, we used to say the leading, but now I'm happy to say a leading standards development organization operating in the areas of cloud, grid, and generally speaking, advanced distributed computing in all its forms. It pursues these topics quite uniquely and almost puristically in an open process with in an open forum, exactly as it says, to develop and create and promote relevant specifications, use cases, and a whole variety of documents, not just standards, but informational and community practice, experimental documents, a whole range of things that can be used to help document what you're doing, let other people know about it. In some cases, pursue joint specifications that can really produce a standard way of doing things. It does this by engaging partners and participants throughout the international arena to champion these blueprints and promote these practices. I like to say that what OGF largely does when it's doing its job best is listen. We listen to the community, and when we hear certain things happening that trigger the response mechanisms built into the genetics of OGF over the more than a decade that it's been in existence, we go into action to help people say, you know, we recognize that what you're talking about is something that you really ought to write down. You've done something new and exciting. Write an informational document about that. You have 3 labs doing something new, exciting that you're going around giving conference talks about, but we notice that they're actually doing slightly different things. You might want to write a community practice document that documents, well, Lab A is doing this, and University B is doing that, and then there's this individual researcher. You can collaborate on a community practice document that puts these all in one place. One lone person has a great idea, might want to write an experimental document. I'll talk more about the whole pattern that leads us all the way through to the proposed and full recommendations that constitute our output. These specifications really have succeeded. The pattern has worked over the last more than a decade that the organization has been formally in existence. Talk a little bit about that history in a minute. And they pervasively are embedded in almost everything that you do. They also make the opportunity that my job as VP of Standards gives me of going and giving talks to other organizations about what you're doing very exciting, because you are doing a lot of great stuff. OGF began formally after really kind of having seeds in a community that went back well over a decade before this, through a group of meetings called the Grid Forum, a global grid forum after that, which then merged with something called the Enterprise Grid Alliance in the mid-2000s to form Open Grid Forum. And the mandate was written down. If you go to our About OGF pages, ogf.org, you'll see that it really is to take on all forms of advanced distributed computing and try to promote, encourage communication, information exchange, cooperation, and best practices and use and eventually standardization. Where our strengths really began to be clear in the mid-2000 time period was in a set of specifications covering the areas of computing, security, networking, a very important, very strong component of the OGF community, from major science and business-related distributed computing, basic execution services, GridFTP, the basis of Globus Online, and much of what we've heard talked about these last few days. Distributed Resource Management Application API, DRAMA, which has just released a version 2, a very nice, credible piece of work. job submission description language, JSTL, resource naming services, glue, usage records. These are the core of the large-scale computing infrastructures that run all the time and on which we hope to build lots of innovation with other new and exciting forms of work. We've also been working on cloud and big data standards because OGF is essentially grounded in its community and really only exists to serve its community, always succeeds the best when it does this listening job well and gets people to come together and write about what they're doing. We sort of have an endless source of the newest work. And already in 2005, work had started on something that's now one of our most successful new specifications, the Open Cloud Computing Interface, which is turning into an extremely popular and well-liked and well-implemented standard for federating and aggregating multiple cloud resources, among other things. We also have cooperative work agreements with many other standards organizations. That's been a very large fraction of my own time these last couple of years, and I'll talk about that later on. The starting point, if you want to learn more about what we've produced, is ogf.org/documents. We are also in the process, by the way, you may notice when you go to the OGF website that certain things have changed. If you're a long-standing member of the community, we don't any longer have the GridForge SourceForge-based tools. We've replaced that with Redmine. You will see over the next few months, year, some migration to our website and web pages. They may acquire a different look and feel, but they'll be based on more modern, more maintainable, and more controllable web technologies. But this, we will always try to keep all these links working. You'll notice that the, let's see if we can get my pointer to work, GFT 200 was just released. We have another half a dozen or so in the pipeline. So 200 times the community has come together and decided it wanted to write something down. You will also notice if you go through this page and click on the little all thing and expand this whole list, that in the early days, it didn't take much to write a grid forum document, GFD. You could go to a conference and say, I thought that was interesting. I tell people it's sort of like reading the archives of the Royal Society, you know, back from the 1700s. Ball lightning seen in Leicester County, you know. And so that's the sort of stuff you'll find. We didn't really set about to do this, but there has been a migration, especially the last 2 or 3 years, to a much more specification-oriented stream. You can always look in this column and say, was this a recommendation or an informational or experimental or a community practice document? There have been a very large number of recs and PRECs I'll show you in a minute. I actually would like to re-encourage that earlier pattern that, you know, these experimental and community practice documents are just as valuable, and we've actually, I think now really ought to work to combat the idea that the only thing you can write is a specification. It's the processes that were written down, the document types that were written down, were there for a purpose. We do want to know about your newest and most experimental work. We do want to know about the ball lightning in Leicester County. We almost had some here last night, I think. All right, so I'll go fairly quickly over this. We really have an extensive set of applicable standards. The result of your work, the community's work, in many areas, federated identity management, managing the trust ecosystem, virtual organization management systems. We take these things for granted, and by and large, the folks that tend to populate meetings like this are the ones who are looking at that as old-fashioned stuff and want to innovate it, but it forms the basis of a lot of running infrastructures. Job submission and workflow management, network management. Our networking community is like the Energizer Bunny. You don't even need to wind them up. They're just self-powered. They will occupy any amount of meeting time we give them at any OGF meeting. They like each other. They regard our conferences as relatively cheap, and they just keep meeting. They'll even meet if we don't have an OGF. It's just nice. And they've done some really fascinating, innovative stuff on software-defined networking, control, things that have been deployed in projects that may have come to a university near you or lab. Secure, fast, multi-party data transfer, GridFTP, and a somewhat odd specification we have called SRM in widespread use, but if you go read it, I think we let that one through the approval process a little too quickly. It's really just like a committee report. We're doing better now, we write better specs, but that's one I would like to go back to and look at and re-examine as to why we need it and what can be done with it. I won't go through the whole list. The Open Cloud Computing Interface, very popular drama, Saga, and ran out of lines in the slide, but Saga is an application framework. There should be a line about applications here. Firewall traversal. Do you know we have a firewall traversal protocol? Well thought out thing. If you're struggling with firewalls, I encourage you to read this. We're trying to gather this in different settings so that we can recast a lot of the recent work to highlight the stuff that's specifically applicable to some of the newer programming methods, for example, cloud. If we just quickly look across more than a decade of history from 2000 to early 2013, you see that we had a very productive period of the mid-2000s, but we basically averaged a dozen or so documents, somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to a dozen documents a year, and that the character has been changing. If you look at the full recommendations, the ones, all right, so to become a full recommendation, you have to have been a proposed recommendation for at least 6 months, and unusually in the standards world, to come back and become a full recommendation, you have to document multiple implementations and go through another review from the community. And that process has been done, a dozen or so times. It's really not that many out of that 200 set of documents. And in this we see a lot of very mature work. This is the most mature output of OGF, the full recommendation. I always like to say informational, hey, I thought this was interesting. You might want to know about it. Community practice, here's a bunch of us that are doing this stuff. Experimental, I think this might be fun. Proposed recommendation, here's how we think you ought to do it. And we've checked with people. A full recommendation is, this is how you should do this. As the result of the community coming to that decision and writing it down and reviewing it and talking itself in, I always like to make the analogy of the hobbits that like everything that they already know neatly written down and printed in red binders and filed properly. This is our most mature output. If you look at our proposed recommendation, it's about 3 times as many. I will call your attention, Raj, to GridFTP, GFD 20, 10% of our volume output in 2003. It doesn't document what GridFTP actually does now. This needs to be revised. It prints out on yellow parchment if you print GridFTP 20. It's pre-aged. So we do need to sort of catch up and clean up this whole body of output. So there's plenty of work just from that very productive pulse of work that you saw in the previous slides that ought to be looked back at and refined. But we're also doing new work, the Open Cloud Computing Interface, published in 2011, fully 2 years before anything else in the standard space was mature enough to compete with it or even be thought of on the same basis, because we started on that set of specs in 2005. All right, so you might ask, all right, this is fine for academics and people who like talking to each other themselves. What about, can you show us any evidence that this has been taken up in industry? And this is just a sort of random sampling. It's kind of like asking how many people are using GridFTP. We can tell you about the ones that are connected to monitoring systems that are talking to us. We can't tell you about everything, but here's some work. Drama that I mentioned is essentially built into almost any major scheduler that you want to think about. It was the basis of the design of SGE. SGE doesn't exist anymore, but it persists in our community, partly because it's based on a good set of specs. Torque, PBS Works, Gridway, Condor, all implement Drama. The basic execution services, job submission description language, WS agreement, a set of specifications that describe agreements in formal XML, and the WS agreement negotiation, the ability to negotiate parameters of those agreements. Here is a set of grids that I will need a few more minutes. A set of grids that implement this across the world. Again, the ones that report to us are somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 million cores, almost half of that in the worldwide LHC computing grid, moving about 12 gigabytes a second. I think I saw that Globus Online is moving about 2 gigabytes a second right now. So, respectable workflows. OGF standards power some of the largest supercomputing infrastructures in the world, and the cloud infrastructure layers of these are just being written. We would love to be the community that helps document those. Why open standards? Well, we think that the answer to the question that I tried to ask yesterday is that it worked better. We all know the answer. The API should not be a point of contention. The API should be pluggable, should be under your control to achieve the goal that the service providers are pluggable and under your control. And standards let you do that. I have to say a few words about the work that OGF has done in clouds, as exemplified, for example, in the EGI cloud architecture. Here's some science goals that might be, or maybe even provider goals, to be able to control your virtual machines, to do data management, to manage information, to federate your access and control infrastructure, to have service registries, monitoring, counting. This is how these get implemented in standards. I believe that OGF serves its community best if we don't get hung up on the idea that we're the only ones who do this. That's why I say a leading standards organization, not the leading standards organization. So we do a lot of work to try to draw the attention of our community to work done by other standards organizations. Most of the standards in the EGI Federated Cloud are OGF standards, Open Cloud Computing Interface to manage a whole variety of different providers, Open Nebula, OpenStack, WNode, Stratus Lab. There are OCCI implementations of almost any cloud stack out there, Amazon, Azure, everything. So we're running out of things that OCCI has not been interfaced with. VOMs, some places that don't have standards yet, like in monitoring that we're working on. But here, CDMI, the Cloud Data Management Interface from the Storage Networking Industry Association, we formed a whole organization to help promote the awareness of CDMI in our community. This is how it works in practice. The EGI Federated Cloud basically integrates all these service providers running OpenStack, OpenNebula, Okeanos, whatever they run, Azure, through OCCI for the infrastructure control layers and CDMI for the data. And it works. So here's an experimental answer to your question, how do you avoid vendor lock-in? You do it by having standards that talk to all of these different service providers, and you use that to provide a layer to your users that is much simpler for them to learn. Here's an example of uptake of these standards in industry by an industry consortium in France called Compatible One. I don't have time to explain it, but basically they've used OCCI for everything. They built their entire software products around it. And they've also applied WS Agreement in spaces that we never expected it. WS Agreement is an XML-based, it can be done RESTfully, standard that lets you express the parameters of any agreement in machine-readable terms. They use it to express service templates, not machine templates, service templates that then let you say, I want the following service with 15 of these machines and 3 of those and MySQL server and all this stuff in WS Agreement. Let me just give you a couple of quick highlights of OGF's cooperative agreements. Again, I think that OGF serves its community best if we actively, not passively, actively call attention of the work of other standards organizations to do work of interest to our community. If somebody else has done it, well, that's just that much less for us to do. We can go on to trying to cure cancer or figure out supernovas and stuff. Distributed Management Task Force has a standard that's aimed at the same space as OCCI, developed by a set of vendors called Cloud Infrastructure Management Interface. We have had a work register with them for almost 3 years. We follow their work, and when they get mature enough that we can do interoperability tests, which may be this summer, we will be working actively with them. International Standards Organization has a very formal committee called the Distributed Applications, Platforms, and Services, which is focused on cloud computing, among other things. ISO JTC1 SC38, we have a formal category A liaison with them, and we're producing our catalog of standards. Storage Networking Industry Association, CDMI, is a standard from them. We actively started a set of things called Cloud Plugfest. It was just us initially, SNIA, and or they like to be called SNIA, and OGF. We now have had 8 of these things, and we have a number of organizations joining them. Ocean, the European FP7 project for cloud interoperability, funded to work on cloud interoperability, has joined this Cloud Plugfest series. OW2, an open source community that promotes and provides hosting for open source projects, has joined the Cloud Plugfest series. Exceed, we're co-locating with OGF 38. Our networking group is going to meet at the China Networking Conference. OGF 39 will be co-located with the EGI. We have cooperative MOUs with European Telecommunications Standard Institute, which has joined the Cloud Plugfest series, the International Telecommunications Union, Telecommunications Management Forum, Cloud Security Alliance, IEEE, and so forth. I really need you folks to please look at cloudplugfest.org. It is a developer-oriented, trade your laptop set of standards and software testing events, sometimes held simultaneously in different places in the world, co-sponsored now by OGF, SNIA, ETSI, Ocean, OW2. We're asking for others. If you'd like to help co-sponsor this, we want developers. We want people who actually do this stuff. These aren't OGF events. You don't have to sign our OGF intellectual property agreements or any of that stuff. It's open to all. We have a participation agreement to protect pre-release software. It's easy to join. Go to cloudplugfest.org and join. You'll find real industrial strength tools for software testing there that allow you to not say, oh, does this work, but how often, if I pound on it, does it work? What are the detailed test results? These are formal tools that normally cost you a lot of money. You can get at for free, provided to us by ETSI if you join the Cloud Plugfest testing series. Upcoming events, we have the Terrain and Networking Conference, Exceed, Cloud Plugfest 9, which is the Distributed Management Task Force Alliance Partners Technical Summit, a couple of different workshops on federated and interoperable clouds, OGF 39 in Madrid. This is just this coming up in 2013. This is my last slide. I hope I've convinced you that OGF is a product of the community. And as a result of being, focusing on the thing that we can control, which is how well we listen to the community, we're engaged with many partners, many projects, with the same goal set down years ago to promote and encourage the best practices and standards in advanced distributed computing, whether or not we thought of them, to draw those to the attention of your community, to help you learn how to produce them with informational, experimental, community practice, proposed and full recommendation documents. These work because you guys are smart, and they support a wide variety of flexible architectures, and this experience has allowed us to build and to support these flexible and utility-like infrastructures throughout the world. Thanks.